In this video, we're going to be using our prior knowledge of the regulation of the male reproductive system in order to compare the similarities and differences with how it's regulated in females. As with males, we start at the very beginning by looking at puberty and the onset of sexual maturation. Typically, this occurs earlier in males, as young as 9 or as old as 12, although once again, these numbers are not a hard and fast rule due to the fact that we don't actually know what triggers the onset of puberty. However, once it begins, the hormonal regulation in males is almost identical to the hormonal regulation in females because it features the two very important regulatory locations, that of course being the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland found on the inside of the brain. Now, the primary regulatory hormone produced by the hypothalamus is identical in both males and females, that being gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, which migrates down to the pituitary gland in order to stimulate the production of the two more direct regulatory hormones, that of course being follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, the names for which make a lot more sense when looking at the female reproductive system. So the first thing that we're going to look at is FSH, and the very first thing that FSH does is exactly what its name suggests that it will do, which is to stimulate the walls of the ovaries to release a number of immature follicles and designate one of those that is going to become the primary follicle, which is going to grow into the mature follicle containing the mature ovum that will be released via ovulation. Now, from a hormonal perspective, the other thing that FSH does is it stimulates the cells on the outside of the follicle, which of course are the granulosa, and when FSH stimulates the granulosa, it causes them to produce estrogen. Now, estrogen, as we looked at in the previous video, is involved in a very specific feedback cycle. The more FSH that is produced, the more it stimulates the granulosa to produce estrogen, and therefore the concentration of estrogen as a result of this is going to increase. And as the concentration of estrogen becomes greater, not all of it is going to stay in the ovaries. Some of that estrogen is going to migrate into the circulatory system, where it can eventually travel all the way back up to the hypothalamus. And when the estrogen gets to the hypothalamus, rather than shutting it off, which is what testosterone does in the male reproductive system, estrogen actually increases the hypothalamus's activity, therefore increasing the production of GnRH. Now, if we go back to this regulatory pathway here, more GnRH means that our pituitary gland is going to become more active, and therefore we are going to get more follicle-stimulating hormone and more luteinizing hormone. Now, this means with more FSH is going to stimulate the granulosa to produce even more estrogen, which can make it back to the hypothalamus more easily, increasing activity of the hypothalamus, therefore making more GnRH, therefore more FSH and more LH, and more FSH means that more granulosa stimulation to produce even more estrogen, which can make it back to the hypothalamus to increase its activity, therefore meaning more GnRH, etc., etc., etc. And the result of this is a constantly increasing concentration of estrogen in the female body. So the fact that this is effectively an infinite loop, as long as we keep producing estrogen, shows that this is a very obvious example of positive feedback regulation, because the more this process happens, the more it encourages itself to happen even more. Now, of particular note, in addition to the highly increasing concentration of estrogen that is occurring here, is also the fact that our concentration of LH is also increasing at the same time as FSH is. And as we looked at in the previous video, it is this combination of hormones, the estrogen, that causes the oocyte to grow into a mature ovum, and the LH that stimulates the granulosa to undergo a very radical change in their cell structure. This combination of hormones leads to the process of ovulation, the release of the mature ovum out of the ovary. Now, as this is happening, the LH from the pituitary gland is also going to stimulate the granulosa to undergo a fairly radical structural change, forming the gland that is used in the luteal phase, which of course is the corpus luteum. And the job of the corpus luteum, as we've talked about, is the production of the primary hormone used in regulating pregnancy, that of course being progesterone. And in the event that a successful fertilization has occurred, this would be where the reproductive cycle stops, because we would want the corpus luteum to maintain itself, to keep producing progesterone in order to keep the uterus healthy for the development of the fetus inside of the uterus. However, in the event where there is no pregnancy, we need a shut-off system in order to stop this entire cycle and begin the cycle again. Now, that occurs after the corpus luteum has been formed, because the more time the corpus luteum is active, the more progesterone is going to be produced. Basically, the corpus luteum does not stop producing progesterone until it atrophies in the event of menstruation. But remember, of course, that the high estrogen we produced from this positive feedback cycle is still floating around the female body, and when both estrogen and progesterone are able to make it back to the hypothalamus, this is the inhibitory signal. So while estrogen triggers a positive feedback loop, estrogen and progesterone together will actually be the shut-off signal for the hypothalamus. And if the hypothalamus is not active, that means that we don't have any GnRH production, which means in addition to shutting off FSH and therefore shutting off estrogen production, we also no longer have LH, and therefore we have no way to sustain the corpus luteum. And when LH production has been cut off, this is the signal for the corpus luteum to commit cellular suicide and atrophy, basically breaking itself down. And when this occurs, now the only source in the ovaries of progesterone has just been shut down. So therefore, the more estrogen and progesterone we have, the more likely that this will be inhibitory for its own process. So we can see here that this is a clear example of negative feedback regulation. So this is the primary reason why many people say that the female reproductive system's regulation is much more complicated than the male reproductive system, because there are actually two different examples of opposing feedback that are used just in the ovaries themselves. In the next video, we're going to connect how all of this hormonal regulation in the ovaries translates to the specific changes that we see in the uterus, and how menstruation can specifically be prevented in the event of a successful pregnancy.